Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as we approach the 9th hour of this hearing, I want to thank both Mr. Goldman and Mr. Castor for being here today and for your testimony. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not the facts in this matter are contested. I believe they are not contested. And so I'd like to level set here and give you both an opportunity to address some of the facts that I believe are not in dispute. And I want to begin by addressing something that I think we all know for certain, and that's that Russia interfered in our 2016 election. So, Mr. Goldman, after 2 years of investigation, the special counsel concluded that Russia interfered in our elections in, quote, sweeping and systemic fashion. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Mr. Castor, is that right?
Yes.
And Mr. Goldman, am I correct that 0 intelligence agencies have publicly stated that Ukraine attacked our elections in 2016? Is that right?
That's right. I don't even think that the minority is alleging that the Ukrainian government systematically in any meaningful way interfered. I think this is just based on a couple of news articles.
Mr. Castor, correct?
The president had a good faith belief there were some significant Ukrainian officials.
I hear you, and you've said that previously. I guess I'm asking you.
We haven't said that the Ukrainian government.
And there are no intelligence agencies in the United States that have publicly stated that Ukraine has attacked our elections, right? You're not testifying that that's the case?
I'm not, right,
okay.
Correct.
Right. And in fact, President Trump's former Homeland Security advisor, Tom Bossert, said that the idea of Ukraine, for example, hacking the DNC server, was, quote, not only a conspiracy theory, it is completely debunked. That's President Trump's Homeland Security advisor that said those words that you see on the screen to my right. Is that right, Mr. Goldman?
Yes, I saw that interview.
Mr. Castor, you saw that interview?
I'm aware of it, yes.
In fact, isn't it true that none of the witnesses that appeared before your committee testified in support of the theory that Ukraine somehow interfered in our elections? Is that right, Mr. Goldman?
That is absolutely correct.
Mr. Castor?
That's correct, but again,
thank you. No witnesses testified in support. I'll reclaim my time. No witnesses testified in support of that theory before your committee. Mr. Goldman, isn't it also true that your committee, in fact, received testimony indicating that there is evidence that Russia is, in part, perpetrating this false theory that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 elections because Russia wants to deflect blame for its own involvement?
That is correct. We had evidence of that. And I think that it's very important to emphasize what is evidence and what is pure media reports or speculation, because there is no evidence in our investigation that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election.
And in fact, I'd like to put some of the testimony that I believe you might be referencing, Mr. Goldman, on the screen in front of you, both from Mr. Holmes as well as Dr. Fiona Hill. And I will quote from her testimony, "I am very confident based on all the analysis that has been done," and again, I don't want to start getting into intelligence matters, "that the Ukraine government did not interfere in our election in 2016. This is a fictional narrative that is being perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves." You recall that testimony, Mr. Goldman?
I do. I also recall her testifying that in addition to the Ukrainian officials who made a couple of disparaging comments about President Trump, there are officials from countries all around the world who also made disparaging comments about President Trump. And as Dr. Hill said, their military assistance was not put on hold.
So given your testimony and given yours as well, Mr. Castor, it strikes me that there are, in fact, 4 uncontested facts. First, Russia attacked our 2016 elections. Several intelligence agencies have independently confirmed that this is true. Second, Ukraine did not attack our 2016 elections. There's absolutely no evidence that this baseless conspiracy theory. Third, there is evidence that Russia perpetrated the allegation that Ukraine interfered in our 2016 elections. And finally, that Russia benefits from the U.S. investigating Ukraine, which was made clear through public testimony before your committee. So, Mr. Goldman, is it fair to say that the intelligence community agrees with these 4 conclusions?
The intelligence community definitely agrees with 1 and 2. Dr. Hill testified to 3, as well as there's a public statement from Mr. Putin. And yes, certainly the witnesses emphasized 4, that Russia benefits from this. And we saw in my opening statement President Putin's comment that it's good now that Ukraine is all the talk.
And if that is the case, it begs the question, why would President Trump perpetuate this conspiracy theory already disproven by the entirety of the intelligence community that actually helps our adversary, a country that is attacking our elections in real time? With that, I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Stubbe.
Mr. Chairman, brief parliamentary inquiry about the schedule.
The gentleman, Mr. Stubbe, has already been recognized. He has the time.
So are you going to recognize him for his parliamentary inquiry after my questioning?
I'll make an announcement about the schedule shortly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've never seen a more partisan spectacle than what I've witnessed here today. Democrats want the rules to apply when it benefits them and not to apply when Republicans invoke them. 9 hours ago now, Mr. Burke, a hired gun for the Democrats, got 30 minutes to spread his partisan rhetoric and then 45 minutes to cross-examine witnesses. That's 70 minutes more than most of the members of this committee who have been elected by their districts to serve in the United States Congress. And Mr. Burke is an unelected New York lawyer specifically brought in by the Democrats to give his opinion, a politically biased consultant who has given hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal elections to the likes of Act Blue, Hillary Clinton, Obama, and Biden. Mr. Burke gave over $5,000 alone to Hillary Clinton for her presidential race. No wonder why he has an axe to grind. Mr. Burke is a white-collar criminal defense lawyer who brags on his website of getting New York financial brokers deferred prosecution for tax fraud and fund managers off for insider trading charges. And Mr. Burke was able to say whatever he wanted to say without swearing an oath to his testimony that it would be truthful. So he can sit before this committee, not as a fact witness, and directly lie to the American people without any threat of criminal prosecution. Makes sense. He's a white-collar criminal defense lawyer. I'm sure he didn't want to incriminate himself. This is the same Mr. Burke who authored a series of reports as early as October 2017, 2 years ago, on his opinion as to whether President Trump obstructed justice and colluded with Russia. He also represented Mayor Bill de Blasio in a federal investigation of de Blasio's fundraising activities. For my fellow Americans and Floridians watching this charade, this is who was sitting at the top of the dais next to the chairman acting like a member of this committee, a partisan New York lawyer with written bias against President Trump who gave thousands to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. And all of this spectacle, all of it, not a single fact witness has appeared in front of this committee. We have been denied a minority hearing day, which I asked for the last hearing. All we have had testify are partisan lawyers giving their opinions. So let's talk about the facts that we do have before us. We heard from Mueller. No evidence that the Trump campaign colluded or conspired with Russia to influence the 2016 election. No obstruction of justice. After denying the president to call witnesses in closed-door secret proceedings and denying Republicans from calling all their witnesses in closed-door proceedings, denying the president's counsel to cross-examine witnesses in intel hearings, the facts are this. Sondland stated when questioned, "Did the president tell you about any preconditions for anything?" His answer, no. For the aid to be refused? No. For a White House meeting? No. Ambassador Sondland also testified that President Trump wanted nothing from Ukraine. Tim Morrison, when questioned, and there was no quid pro quo, answered, correct. The aid was released. 4 facts never change. Both President Trump and President Zelensky say there was no pressure. The call transcript shows no conditionality between aid and an investigation, no quid pro quo. Ukrainians were not aware that aid was withheld when the president spoke. Ukraine didn't open an investigation, but still received aid in a meeting with President Trump. Mr. Castor, has any committee heard from the whistleblower, either in closed-door hearings or in open hearings?
No.
Did Chairman Schiff state that he would call the whistleblower to testify?
He did.
Has that happened?
It has not.
Is it going to occur?
I hope so.
Have other countries' aid also been held up?
Yes.
Mr. Goldman, on October 2nd, the New York Times reported that the whistleblower, quote, approached a House Intelligence Committee aide with his concerns about Mr. Trump. Is that accurate?
Sorry, say that again?
On October 2nd, the New York Times reported that the whistleblower approached a House Intelligence Committee aide with his concern about Mr. Trump. Is that accurate?
I think the whistleblower's concerns about President Trump are from the threats that
No, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, did the whistleblower approach a House Intelligence Committee? Let me ask it a different way. Have you had any communications with the whistleblower?
As I said earlier in response to questions from your colleagues, I'm not going to get into any.
So you're refusing to answer whether you've communicated with the whistleblower?
The whistleblower is not relevant to this report.
He's the whole basis of the beginning of this investigation. He's absolutely relevant
Well,
to this committee
he's
and
not
to the
relied
American
upon.
people.
The whistleblower's complaints, for the reasons that Mr. Castor said, are not included. His allegations are not included in our report because the evidence has been outstripped and surpassed by the 17 witnesses that we have had come in to testify directly about the conduct that the whistleblower blew
So
the
as
whistle
you sit
about.
here today, do you know the identity of the whistleblower?
Sir, I'm not going to talk to you about the identity of the whistleblower.
Because you're also refusing to answer whether you've had
this was what the
communications.
intelligence-
That's my time, not yours. You're refusing to answer whether you had communications with the whistleblower. Has any other staff in the Intel Committee had communications with the whistleblower?
Sir, in the Intelligence
And you're
Committee,
refusing to answer that question.
in
And
the
unfortunately, the
Intelligence
American people want to know those answers, and unfortunately, my time is expired.
Congress has a right
Time
to
of the-
Chairman, retain the
time of the-
anonymity
Mr. Chairman.
of the-
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Time,
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous
Time of
consent.
the-
I have unanimous consent.
gentleman will suspend. The time of the gentleman, the time of the gentleman has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent.
The gentleman will state his unanimous consent request.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I ask for admission of the document entitled Ukrainian Efforts to Sabotage Trump Backfire, dated January 11th, 2017.
We'll, if you give it to our staff, we'll take a look at it and we'll make,
Should I make a
that
motion to
shortly.
insert instead, Mr. Chairman?
I want to, before I recognize Ms. McBath, I want to announce that with respect to scheduling, that this hearing will proceed until the votes are called. It may end before votes are called, which would be nice. If it does not end before votes are called, then we will recess for the votes and we'll reconvene here as soon as the votes on the floor are over. It's going to be a close call. We'll see. I will further announce that I'm not prepared to say anything further about the schedule of the committee beyond today's hearing.
Point of order,
Mr.
Chairman.
Who seeks recognition for a point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Who's I?
To your right, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Deutsch seek recognition?
To ask, I wanted to confirm, a point of order is there are rules of decorum, and I don't believe that the gentleman from Florida meant to violate them, and I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, but more than once he referred to a New York lawyer, and if he could just explain what he meant, then I'm prepared to withdraw my point of order.
It's not a point of order. That's not a cognizable point of order.
Mr. Chairman, point of order regarding the schedule.
The point of order regarding the schedule, there's no
Yes.
point of order regarding
Well,
the
on this case, there is because
There's no
rules-
point of order
rules have been
regarding the
violated.
schedule.
Then
There's no-
parliamentary
there's no
inquiry. Will you answer my question? It's a
The gentleman will suspend. There is no cognizable point of order regarding the future schedule.
okay. A
Ms.
parliamentary
McBath.
inquiry. Will you recognize that?
No, Ms. McBath is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldman, I want to follow up on just one part of President Trump's conduct that, excuse me, I asked our constitutional scholars about last week. The investigative committees found evidence that President Trump intimidated, threatened, and tampered with prospective and actual witnesses in the impeachment inquiry, correct?
Yes.
And Mr. Goldman, it is a federal crime to intimidate or to seek to intimidate any witness appearing before Congress. Is that right?
Yes, there's a little bit more to it, but that's the gist of it, yes.
Mr. Goldman, am I correct that President Trump publicly attacked witnesses before, after, and even during their testimony?
That is correct.
I'd like to quickly go through some examples. On Twitter, the president tried to smear Ambassador Bill Taylor, a former military officer who graduated at the top of his class at West Point, served as an infantry commander in Vietnam, and earned a Bronze Star and an Air Medal with a V device for valor. He was attacked for doing his duty to tell the truth to the American people, correct?
He did his duty by testifying, yes.
President Trump also attacked other Trump administration officials who testified before the Intelligence Committee, including Lieutenant Colonel Alexander S. Vindman, who is the director for Ukraine on the National Security Council, and Jennifer Williams, the special advisor on Europe and Russia with the Office of the Vice President. Am I right?
That is right, yes.
Mr. Goldman, I think another troubling example of this is the president's treatment of Ambassador Yovanovitch. When you questioned Ambassador Yovanovitch, you asked her about the president's remark that she would, and I quote, go through some things. She told you that that remark sounded like a threat. Is that right?
Yes, in the July 25th call, that's when President Trump said that.
Ambassador Yovanovitch is a career professional who served in Republican and Democratic administrations. She was once caught in live crossfire during a coup attempt. And here's how she described that experience in her very own words.
I later served in Moscow. In 1993, during the attempted coup in Russia, I was caught in crossfire between presidential and parliamentary forces. It took us 3 tries, me without a helmet or body armor, to get into a vehicle to go to the embassy. We went because the ambassador asked us to come. And we went because it was our duty.
It was our duty. Even under such duress, this is a public servant who did her duty. And as she testified before you and the Intelligence Committee, the president tweeted yet another attack against her. Is that correct?
During the testimony, yes.
At a rally, the president further attacked Ambassador Taylor and Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State, George Kent, Foreign Affairs official with decades of bipartisan service. I just have to say, I am so deeply saddened that our president has attacked our brave public servants. These attacks are an abuse of his power, and they betray our national interest. My Republican colleagues until now have agreed with me that this behavior is not okay. That in America we protect witnesses and people who tell the truth. We want people to come forward. We protect witnesses in our community. I myself am no stranger to these kinds of attacks. They are not okay. I want to read a partial statement by Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who is a military officer and a public servant. In his opening statement to the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Vindman said, and I quote, I want to say that the character attacks on these distinguished and honorable public servants is reprehensible. I ran for Congress because I care urgently about health care, gun violence prevention, and our veterans. Those are the urgent policies for me and many of my colleagues. But these witnesses, these public servants, stood up and courageously told the truth. And I must be courageous and stand up for them as well. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. A few minutes ago, Mr. Biggs asked unanimous consent to admit an article from Politico into the record without objection. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard today from some suggesting that this process has somehow been unfair. Mr. Goldman, let's clear up that record. Minority members on the investigative committees had access to all witness depositions. Is that correct?
Yes, and all the documents.
And were they allowed to ask questions of every witness?
The minority was given equal time to the majority for every single interview, deposition, or hearing that we did.
And the minority were allowed to call their own witnesses to the live hearings. Is that correct?
They were also, yes, and they did, and they got 3 witnesses. They were also allowed to call their own witnesses for the depositions. They chose not to do that. The only witness they requested for the deposition was Chairman Schiff, who is not a fact witness to this investigation.
Mr. Goldman, why did the investigative committees decide to conduct initial depositions behind closed doors?
The best investigative practice when you're doing a fact-finding mission is to keep the information closed. And the reason is exactly what I described earlier with Ambassador Sondland, who, first of all, the day before his deposition, he spoke with Secretary Perry about his testimony. That is the type of tailoring that can happen when people are engaged in misconduct and they try to line up their stories. So if you keep the information closed, they can't line up their stories. And I think, frankly, part of the reason why Ambassador Volker and Ambassador Sondland's public hearing testimony was so different from their deposition testimony is because the initial depositions were in closed session before we then released all the transcripts to the public.
And this isn't unprecedented because in both the Nixon and Clinton impeachment inquiries, there were either closed-door depositions or grand jury proceedings at the beginning of the inquiries.
That's correct, nor is it unprecedented in Congress. This is actually a rule in the House rules that was passed by Republican Congresses. It was used in Benghazi. It was used by a number of committees for the past decade or so.
And for clarity, President Trump has received all procedural protections afforded to other presidents facing impeachment. Is that correct?
That is right. In the Judiciary Committee, he's had all of the options. Our inquiry was not the Judiciary Committee's investigation. That is where the president's ability to present evidence. Of course, if the president wanted to present evidence in the Intelligence Committee, he could have provided documents, he could have provided the witnesses that we asked for him, but he obstructed rather than cooperated.
And the president has been invited to participate in the House's impeachment inquiry, correct?
Yes. And
but the president declined the invitation?
That's my understanding, yes.
Twice?
Twice thus far, yes.
In fact, the president not only refused to participate, but he has also tried to stop Congress from obtaining evidence. Isn't it true that the president has refused to produce any documents in response to the impeachment inquiry's subpoena to the White House?
Yes.
Not a single one.
Not a single document.
The president also directed all of his agencies to refuse to produce documents. Is that right?
That is also true.
Based on the president's order, federal agencies have ignored more than 70 specific requests or demands for records from the investigative committees. Is that correct?
Yes, and if I could just add, this would ordinarily be a document case. If you were prosecuting this case, you'd be basing it on the documents. So the fact that those documents are being withheld is quite significant, and it's quite remarkable that we built the record we have on the witnesses.
The president's order to obstruct Congress didn't just extend to documents. At the president's direction, witnesses also refused to testify. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in total, more than a dozen members of the administration defied lawful subpoenas or requests for testimony or documents, as we see on the slide.
Right, between testimony and documents, that's correct.
And isn't it also true that when witnesses chose to follow the laws and testify, the president denied those witnesses access to the documents they needed to properly prepare for their testimony?
For some of them, that's correct.
But I also must acknowledge that this process has been challenging and in many respects less than fair. I have not had access to all of my phone records, State Department emails, and many, many other State Department documents. And I was told I could not work with my EU staff to pull together the relevant files and information. These documents are not classified, and in fairness, should have been made available.
The State Department has collected all materials in response to the September 27th subpoena that may contain facts relevant to my testimony. I have no such documents or materials with me today.
The president was not denied the right to participate, quite the opposite. The president has chosen not to participate, and he has consistently tried to obstruct the impeachment investigation to ensure no one testifies against him, that no one produces a document that may incriminate him, and to engage in a cover-up to prevent the American people from learning the truth. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I just say something
yields
for
back.
5 seconds? Mr. Chairman, please.
Gentlemen, for what purpose is the gentleman seeking?
No, this is the witness. Can I just say something for 5 seconds?
No. The gentlelady, Ms. Dean is recognized. Good job.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldman, some have argued that we should wait, that we're moving too fast, that we should try to get more evidence. Let's examine why these arguments are without merit. President Nixon stated during the Senate Watergate investigation, quote, "All members of the White House staff will appear voluntarily when requested by the committee. They will testify under oath, and they will answer fully all proper questions," end quote. During the investigation of President Clinton, Ken Starr interviewed White House staff. President Clinton also provided written responses to 81 interrogatories from the House Judiciary Committee. Unlike his predecessors, President Trump has categorically stonewalled Congress's investigation at every turn. Indeed, as far back as April, the president expressed his intent to stonewall.
Well, we're fighting all the subpoenas.
More recently, on October the 8th, White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, echoed this sentiment in a letter reflecting the president's instruction that all executive branch officials not testify in this impeachment inquiry. Are you aware of that letter, Mr. Goldman?
Yes, I am.
And Mr. Goldman, is it fair to say that President Trump is the only president in the history of our country to seek to completely obstruct an impeachment inquiry undertaken by this House?
That is correct. It is unprecedented.
And in fact, pursuant to President Trump's order, 12 executive branch officials refused to testify as part of the House impeachment inquiry, 10 of whom defied congressional subpoenas. Am I right?
Yes.
Given the president's sweeping directive not to cooperate with Congress, did the investigative committees believe that there was any chance that other administration officials would come forward if subpoenaed?
No, it became clear that the president was trying to block everything and block everyone, and eventually they came up with an alternative reason to write an opinion to prevent people from coming, which is quite an aggressive view that they took. But it was quite clear that they were trying to block every single witness.
Some have said that the investigative committee should have gone to court. Did you decide not to go to court?
We thought about it a lot because obviously there are additional witnesses and we want this to be as thorough an investigation. But as you can see from the Deutsche Bank case or the McGahn case, it takes months and months to go through the appeals court. And that's effectively what the president wants, is just to delay this as long as possible and to the next election.
Let's take a look at that exact case, the McGahn case, because we're all intimately aware of it. On April 22nd, this Judiciary Committee served a subpoena for testimony to White House counsel Don McGahn. And after McGahn refused to testify on May 21st, the committee filed a lawsuit on August the 7th to compel his testimony. And even though we did request expedited ruling, it was another 3.5 months before Judge Jackson found the Constitution does not allow a president to kneecap congressional investigations because, as the judge wrote, and I put up on this screen, quote, presidents are not kings. As you know, McGahn has appealed, and a hearing is set for January the 3rd now of next year. As we sit here today, 8 months since we issued that subpoena, would you agree it's likely we will not have an appeals court ruling for many months to come?
It's quite possible that it could be several more months, and then there may be the Supreme Court.
Exactly. McGahn may appeal to the Supreme Court, and conceivably that could take another many months, year, more.
Depends on whether it's this term or it gets pushed over to the next term, but yes.
And given this delay illustrated by the McGahn example specifically, would you agree that if we go to court to enforce the investigative committee subpoenas, we could face another months or years-long delay to hear testimony?
Absolutely, and there's an ongoing threat because the president is trying to cheat to win the next election. It's not something that happened in the past, it's continuing in the future. So we cannot delay and just wait for the courts to resolve this, when the reason why we would have to go to the courts is because the president is obstructing an investigation into himself.
And the urgency is not just about our elections, but also our national security, am I right?
That is a critical component to it.
Let me end with this. What is plain is that we cannot wait. What is plain is that wait means never. We must not let this president disregard, defy, and delay justice. This president has shown that he repeatedly abuses the power entrusted to him by the people. Every moment we wait is another opportunity to chip away at the foundation of our Constitution, so carefully crafted by our founders. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I yield to Ms. Jackson-Lee for the unanimous consent request.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Goldman, Mr. Castor. I'd like to submit or ask unanimous consent to insert in the record, referred in my questioning, Statement of Administration Policy, Department of Defense Appropriations.
Without objection.
August 5th.
Without objection, Ms. McCarcel.
And the call dated July 25th.
Without objection, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Castor, it's been a long day, been a long couple months. You've been in the middle of this, and I know previously you wanted to say something, so.
Thank you. I've resisted my willingness to be athletic here in the afternoon. But I want to say a few things. First of all, the Republicans on the Intelligence Committee submitted a number of subpoenas, and we never got a vote. There was a motion to table. It disposed of them. Ranking Member Nunes sent a letter on November 8th asking for witnesses. Ranking Member Collins sent a letter on December 6th asking for witnesses. Some of these witnesses would have touched at the heart of the issue that our members are concerned about, and that is, were Ukrainians trying to interfere with our elections? I mean, this is a fact that is meritorious of investigation. The Ukrainians ought to investigate it, and to the extent it happened here in the U.S., we ought to be investigating it. And so, to the extent that hasn't happened, Republicans have attempted to do that during this process. So, I'd like to say that. And I have a couple other things, Mr. Armstrong, if I may. Ambassador Sondland is relied on, and he went from a witness that was not very favorable to very favorable at his hearing. And one of the remarkable statements at his hearing was that everyone was in the loop. And he types up this email to Pompeo, to the secretary. And the emails that he used to demonstrate that everyone was in the loop are not conclusive at all. He talks about this statement that was going back and forth during the early part of August. First of all, Volker said all along that he didn't think the statement was a good idea. Volker and Yarmak toyed around with the statement, and ultimately both sides decided that it wasn't a good plan, so they didn't do it. And so the fact that Sondland is emailing the secretary talking about this statement and so forth, this doesn't show that everyone's in the loop. Ambassador Hale testified to us that people at the State Department, they don't just email the secretary. I mean, the secretary gets email, of course, but it's not like this. There's a whole secretariat that filters his email. And so it's not, emailing the Secretary of State is not quite as simple as I think Ambassador Sondland made it seem here. And so I just wanted to address that. We talked a couple times about the reliability of George Kent's notes. One of Ambassador Volker's assistants, Catherine Croft, testified, and it was a rather startling piece of testimony. She was asked whether Kent's notes would be reliable. Sort of a typical question, and everyone expecting the answer to be yes, except she said, no, I don't think Kent's notes would be reliable. So I think that's important to put on the record that, that there is evidence that, perhaps Mr. Kent, felt some emotions about some of these issues, and his notes, at least according to one State Department official, might not in fact be reliable. The CNN interview that there's been discussion about. Okay, there was discussion about possibly doing a statement which was canned. There was, maybe there was discussion of a CNN interview, but that's fine. We did not really get to the bottom of that. That was sort of this amorphous fact that was out there. Ambassador Taylor testified that he was worried it would happen, but we didn't really talk to anyone that could tell us precisely what was going to occur, in the CNN interview and whether President Zelensky was actually going to do it. If you look back at the statement that Yarmak and Volker were talking about, Yarmak wasn't comfortable doing it. And so when it comes to the CNN interview, it's possible that Yarmak would have advised President Zelensky not to say what people thought he was going to say. So anyway, I'm sorry, Mr. Armstrong, for taking so much time.
You've worked hard and you deserve it. I just want to end and summarize with this, that you can, because you cannot prove a crime, and the chairman went on TV yesterday and said they get a conviction in 3 minutes, but my question is, for what crime? The Mueller conspiracy fell flat. The obstruction charge was abandoned when the public hearing was over. Campaign finance is a non-starter. The victim of conspiracy, or the victim of bribery and extortion, says he's not a victim. Because you can't prove any of it does not mean you can use all of it, and that's no way to prosecute a case, and it is no way to proceed with impeachment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell is recognized.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Goldman, I want to come back and highlight what I think is the biggest national security threat, and that's foreign interference into our elections. And I can tell you that in Florida, we're extremely concerned about the security of our elections and the potential for election interference by foreign governments, especially Russia, because Florida, my home state, was a victim of Russian hacking in 2016. And there's every indication that they're trying to do the same thing right now. Our country was founded on the premise that our elected officials are elected by the people. But President Trump doesn't share these ideas. He has and continues to demand foreign interference into our elections. He doesn't want the American people to decide. He's inviting foreign interference, allowing foreign governments to decide that for us. Mr. Goldman, it's been confirmed that President Trump's campaign actively sought Russia's interference in our 2016 elections, correct?
What Special Counsel Mueller said is that President Trump did invite them and solicit them to hack Hillary Clinton's emails. Ultimately, the Trump campaign, I think, was welcomed, knew about the interference, welcomed it, and utilized it.
Right, and in 2016, Trump said, Russia, if you're listening, and within 5 hours, Russian intelligence targeted the emails of Trump's opponent. On October 3rd, 2019, when asked what he hoped President Zelensky would do about the Bidens, this is what President Trump said.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer. They should investigate the Bidens, because how does a company that's newly formed, and all these companies, if you look at, and by the way, likewise, China should start an investigation into the Bidens.
And let me just point out, the president doesn't mention corruption, does he, Mr. Goldman?
No, he doesn't. As I said, it became quite clear in all of his comments and all of the other witnesses that any mention of corruption or anti-corruption was really meant, and the evidence showed this, was really a euphemism for the investigations.
Correct. And Trump is not only asking, President Trump, excuse me, is not only asking Ukraine, but he also says China should start investigating his political opponents. The president's pattern of behavior is incredibly disturbing. Russia, Ukraine, China, he's inviting 3 countries to help him in his re-election campaign. And Mr. Goldman, I don't see any reason to believe he wouldn't ask any other governments, for example, Venezuela, correct?
He could, I mean, at this point, he has shown not only a willingness to do it multiple times, but I think more importantly for all of the members' consideration, he's also shown a lack of contrition, a lack of acknowledgement that what he is doing is wrong and that it is wrong. And if you don't recognize that it is wrong, then there is no reason why you won't do it again if you've already done it.
Exactly. I mean, we saw Giuliani in Ukraine just 3 days ago. And last night, I want to point out that the Washington Post actually released an article saying that Rudy Giuliani has been now advising on how to open a back channel between President Trump and Maduro. So I'm very worried about that. Now, I don't think we have any time to wait to see if any countries are now going to take him up on the offer to help him in his re-election campaign. Mr. Goldman, did the investigative committees reach any conclusions about the ongoing threats, the continuing risk that the president poses?
Yes, for the same reasons that we just discussed. I mean, and I think the June of television interview with George Stephanopoulos this year, where the president indicated that he would once again welcome foreign interference, is another data point to understand where it is. And I would just say to Mr. Reschenthaler, who was saying that he's got such a great record and that the Democrats just don't want him to win, the question is, if that is the case, and that very well may be the case, then why does he need to cheat to win the election? Why can't he just go on his own platform?
I think the Constitution demands that the president follow the rule of law and fight to keep our elections fair, free of corruption, and free of Russian interference, foreign interference. Now, I know that I was elected by the people of Florida, and I work only for the people of this country. I'm not going to let, while I'm in office, anyone interfere in our elections or threaten our democracy. The continuing pattern of behavior we've seen from this president should be a warning to the American people that it is a beginning of a dictatorship, which I have seen in Latin America. I've witnessed men in office abuse the power, inviting foreign interference, and also obstructing any checks on their power. The Constitution has no partisan allegiance. We cannot allow this behavior from this president or any future president. Our democracy depends on it.
The gentlelady yields back. I recognize Mr. Jordan for the purpose of a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
I recognize Mr. Jordan for the purpose of a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The majority's witness was wrong when he said that we were able to subpoena people and get our
Unanimous
witnesses here.
consent request.
We were not. So I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the two letters sent to Chairman Nadler and the other one to
Without objection, the material will be entered into the record. Ms. Escobar is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and many thanks to our witnesses who've spent the entire day with us. We're very grateful. Despite what our Republican colleagues have stated over and over again, their own witness, Mr. Castor, has agreed that these investigations have indeed produced direct evidence which any objective observer, in my opinion, would regard as overwhelming. That evidence proves that the president solicited foreign interference in the 2020 election, pressured Ukrainian President Zelensky to publicly announce unfounded investigations, conditioned a White House meeting, the president conditioned a White House meeting and $391 million on the announcement of the investigations, and then the president covered up his conduct and obstructed the investigation. Those findings reflect a serious abuse of power by the president. Yet we are being asked to ignore what we've seen with our own eyes and what we've heard with our own ears. So, Mr. Goldman, I'd like your help in responding to some of the claims that my Republican colleagues have made today.
Happily.
The president and his allies say that there was no quid pro quo. In other words, they claim that the president wasn't withholding the aid in exchange for the manufactured political investigation. Isn't it true that the aid was withheld and that there has been no logical explanation for the withholding of that aid?
There's common sense that leads one to conclude that the aid was withheld for the investigations. And then there's also direct evidence in that the president's own words to Ambassador Sondland on September 7th said the same thing.
Thank you. President Trump knew he had leverage over President Zelensky, and in fact, David Holmes testified that Ambassador Sondland told President Trump that President Zelensky will, quote, do anything you ask him. Is that correct?
That is what Ambassador Sondland said. Yeah, or actually, that's what Ambassador Sondland said to President Trump. Apologies.
You testified earlier that evidence shows that the Ukrainians, in fact, did know that the aid was being withheld. My colleagues continue to say, and their witness continue to say, that there couldn't be leverage because they had no idea that the aid was being withheld. Yet there has been evidence that shows that they knew. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's important just for a second here to take a step back. It doesn't matter when they knew, as long as they knew at some point. Then they realized at that point that the investigations were dependent on the aid. But in addition, there is a lot of evidence that they knew before it became public on August 28th.
And you're right, it doesn't matter. If you're about to be held up at gunpoint by a burglar, it doesn't matter whether you know or not. The intent is still there by the criminal about to commit the act. My Republican colleagues also make much about the fact that the aid was finally released. But isn't it true that it wasn't released until the president got caught?
It wasn't released until the president got caught, and all of the money didn't actually get to Ukraine in that fiscal year, and you all in Congress had to pass another law to allow for the money to get to Ukraine.
Thank you. Earlier today, Mr. Castor attempted to explain away the president's request for foreign interference in our election by claiming that the president had three concerns. That number one, the president was concerned about Ukraine corruption. That number two, he was concerned about burden sharing with Europe. And number three, he brought up the debunked conspiracy theory about Ukraine election interference, which, by the way, that last point we know is a Russian talking point. Mr. Goldman, did the investigative committees consider those three explanations? And if so, what did the evidence show about whether President Trump's request was actually motivated by those concerns?
It's a very good question. There are two things that were discussed here today. One is evidence, and one is assertions and opinions. Based on the evidence, there is no evidence to support any of those three things that you just mentioned. There's no evidence to think that the president acted towards Ukraine because of his concerns about corruption, even if he held those concerns. That was not the motivating factor. There's no evidence that his concern about other European countries giving enough money motivated him. And there is certainly not a reasonable belief, given all of the evidence, that he believed that Ukraine interfered in our 2016 elections.
Thank you. I'd like to close with what our scholars explained to us last week about why all of this is so important.
Drawing a foreign government into our elections is an especially serious abuse of power because it undermines democracy itself.
Because if we cannot impeach a president who abuses his office for personal advantage, we no longer live in a democracy. We live in a monarchy, or we live under a dictatorship.
If what we're talking about is not impeachable, then nothing is impeachable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Can I respond to that?
This concludes the 5-minute round of questioning. I now recognize Mr. Raskin for the purpose of a unanimous consent request.
Mr. Chairman, I'm seeking unanimous consent to introduce a statement by the late Chairman Elijah Cummings of the Oversight Committee in his first hearing in the new Congress, which was on examining prescription drug prices. His first hearing was not about Michael Cohen, as was asserted earlier.